AM 1420, WBSM.
Good evening and welcome to Spooky South Coast. Tim Weisberg with you, flying solo tonight. The silent assassin Matt Costa, science advisor Matt Moniz, and psychic medium Stephanie Burke, all out of the program tonight. But you're stuck with me. Happy New Year, almost. Merry Christmas, belated. It's been a little while since we've talked to you here on Spooky South Coast. We have been kind of otherwise indisposed over the holiday season. That's what happens this time of year between wrestling and traveling and everything else that's been going on. It's nice to finally be able to sit down and talk about the paranormal with you. Although tonight we're not really going to be talking about the paranormal. Tonight we're going to be joined by a couple of guests a little bit later on that will talk with us about Star Trek. We're going to take a deep dive into the world of Star Trek with Mark Cushman, who is an author and an LA-based screenwriter and director who has worked on some of the Star Trek programs. We're also going to be talking with Vic Mignogna, who is a veteran voice actor who has worked on the popular web series Star Trek Continues, where he plays Captain Kirk. So we'll be joined by Vic and Mark a little bit later on to talk Star Trek, and of course we'll take your calls, 508-996-0500, 877-996-1420 if you need to call from outside of the local area. We have that option for you. Now, tonight, I also want to let you know a little something, too. For those of you who were following along on my Facebook page or on my Twitter, you may have seen that I gave some of this information. I was secretive about it a few weeks ago when I said I was going to miss the show a couple weeks ago because I had to travel. I had to go down to Atlanta for the weekend, and I couldn't really talk about the reason why. Well, I've been given the green light to open up and discuss a little bit about that. So I flew down to Atlanta to film for an upcoming television series that will be airing on the Weather Channel in early 2020. Yes, the Weather Channel is getting into the paranormal game, well, a little bit. The name of the show is called The Scariest Stuff on Earth. And what it's going to do is it's going to analyze some of the interesting reports that have come from around the world and look at it from a variety of different perspectives. Now, that's all that I can say. I can't really get too deep into the content of what we talked about, but I was the person offering the paranormal perspective for some of the videos and cases that we investigated for part of the show. So basically what's going to happen is you're going to see me peppered throughout the entire season talking about some of these different cases and offering some of my insight and hopefully expertise in what it could be from a paranormal perspective. And they're going to offer other insights as well. So from what I understand, there's not really going to be any definitive conclusions, but we're just going to kind of put everything out there for you, the audience, to analyze. So that's going to be coming up sometime in early 2020. I had a blast filming it. The director, Grace, is phenomenal. The cameraman, Nigel, also very patient with me. I did not have much of a voice. For those of you who tuned into the show a few weeks ago, you know that I was losing my voice. I had a cold, and when that happens, 9 times out of 10, I lose my voice. And it was severely strained, and I was having trouble speaking. I stopped talking as much as I could, knowing that I had to fly and film this, and I thought I was doing pretty well. I thought I was doing okay. My voice was decent. It wasn't as strong as I would hoped it would have been, but I figured I'd be strong enough to go into a day of filming. Didn't know how long it would last. I woke up the morning of, and I don't know if it was from traveling, if it was from sleeping in a hotel bed with a hotel pillow and all that stuff that comes associated with that, but I woke up the next day and I could barely creak out words. And it was funny because I didn't say anything to anybody when I woke up. I woke up, took a shower, had to get up early because filming was going to start at 8 a.m., so I got up at 5, even though I was only going from my hotel to another hotel a block away to do some of the filming. But I woke up and didn't say anything until I went down to check out. And when I went to check out, that's when I first opened my mouth and said, and the poor woman at the checkout counter was like, sir, I can barely understand you. And I was like, well, if you can barely understand me, I'm screwed for the rest of the day. But we got through it. We went through the day as best we could, and it took maybe a little bit longer than maybe everybody had hoped it would have, about 11 hours or so. But I was able to get through all of the different cases that they wanted me to discuss. So that'll be coming up again early 2020. That's all that I know at this time, but I will let you know as soon as I know more about that. It's called The Scariest Stuff on Earth, It will be airing on the Weather Channel, so that's why I was kind of kidding around and saying that I was going to be the Jim Cantori of the Paranormal, because, that's the most recognizable Weather Channel personality, and it's the only person that I know on the Weather Channel anyway. So I think it'll be an interesting show because it gets really deep into, and again, I can't talk about what we discussed, but I can say that we went beyond the surface of, let's just say if they showed a video, as an example of a light in the sky, they didn't just have me talk about UFOs. We went into the really deep mythology and some of the stories from the regions where these would have occurred. So it goes beyond just surface level. Oh, that looks like it could be aliens to me. Like, no, this goes really deep and talks about some of the different things that would have affected the people that were there on the ground, the people that were living in that area, the people who had lived there historically. So it's kind of like, and I hate to make this comparison because Hellier is just so far above what everybody else is doing, but it's almost like they incorporated some elements of Hellier and allowed me to incorporate some elements of, what could be the bigger picture and what could be some of the more out there explanations. They let me kind of work some of that in, and they had some of that too in what they had researched. So I think all together, it's going to kind of come together in a very interesting program. So I'll let you know as soon as I know more about that. But if you hear about it before me, let me know. I'm not a big Weather Channel watcher. Even when there's a storm coming, I don't really watch the Weather Channel. I'll go online and I'll check an app or a website. I usually use AccuWeather, or here at the station we use ABC6. We get customized weather reports from them, and that's how I'll check my weather. But from what I understand, the Weather Channel has been offering all kinds of different types of programming. So it's not just weather-related programs anymore. It's kind of stuff all about the Earth in general. So it's exciting, but also, it's going to be a little while away. So we don't need to talk too much about that. But when we do get into it, I'm hoping that I can get the director, Grace, to join us to preview it when we know that it's going to air. She was very, very patient with me. And, many times I would be speaking and I would be giving, whatever insight that I was giving into this, or some of the history of some of the cases or what have you. And maybe I'd give them something that was really good, but it would always be right when my voice would cut out, and then I'd have to stop and take a drink of water and kind of re-record it again. So it was probably a longer day than it needed to be, but it all got done. And then a very interesting side note. Those of you who listen to the show, I'm a wrestling fan. You know that I did some wrestling ring announcing. I'm now retired from that because House of Bricks is closed up, so I don't have to get beat up anymore. But coming back from Atlanta, I go into the Atlanta airport, and I decide to use the restroom before I get on the plane. Always a good idea. You never want to use the restroom on the plane. And I'm waiting and everything. All the urinals are filled. All the stalls are filled. Finally, one of the stalls opens up. So I go and I make a beeline to get in there. And as I'm walking into the stall, walking out of the stall is WWE superstar Kevin Owens. And I kind of do a double take, and I'm like, "Hey, Kevin." And he just kind of gives me a nod and like, "Hey, what's up?" And walks out of there. And, of all the times to try to introduce yourself to somebody, walking out of a men's room stall, not a good time to do so. But it was just kind of a little funny anecdote. All right, well, we are going to be talking about Star Trek tonight. I will welcome anybody to call in with questions related to the topic during the show. 508-996-0500 is the number. You can also jump into the chat room at Spooky TV at SpookySouthCoast.com, or right on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/SpookySouthCoast. And a lot of you are in there now. I want to say hi to everybody. Thank you for joining us. I know it's been a few weeks, but it's great to see everybody back together. The important thing about tonight, I'm not going to be able to really see the chat room throughout the entire discussion because I am flying solo, so I've got to run a bunch of different things. Plus, I have my notes to look at and everything else, keeping an eye on the phones to see if there's any calls that come in. So I will try and get to the questions as much as I can if they pop up in the chat room. Do me a favor, though. If you have a question in the chat room that you want me to ask, and again, probably the best way to do so tonight is to call in, but if you can't do that and you need to type it in the chat room, the best way to do that is please use all caps. I know that that's bad internet speak because it means you're yelling at me, but that's okay in this case. It's okay to yell at me tonight because I'm not going to see it otherwise. So if you yell in the chat room, if you use all caps with your question, and just, don't do that otherwise. Don't do that unless it's a question that you want me to ask on the air. But if you do that, then I'll hopefully see it and be able to bring it back into the discussion itself. So that would be helping me out tremendously. You can also tweet us at SpookySC, or you can email us spookykrew@spookysouthcoast.com. But the phone is the best way to ask your questions tonight, 508-996-0500. If you need to check out those numbers at any point, you will see them right up at spookysouthcoast.com, or you can go to WBSM.com as well. And if you need to type it out, please do so in the chat and do so in all caps so that I'll be able to work it all up and work it all into the show. One of the questions that I keep getting asked is what's going to go on with Spooky South Coast events in 2020? Do we have any plans for any upcoming ghost hunts? We do. The problem is right now there's a lot of fluctuation in schedule. So we're really having a hard time pinning down some dates for things, but I'm hoping that coming up in the next month, we'll be able to start announcing some things that we have in the works. We would love to get back out and do some investigations. Haven't done any investigations since October when we had a couple of events then. So we'd love to get out there and do some stuff with you. The usual thing happens in January where all of our bills come due. All of our streaming bills and all of our website bills and all of our podcasting bills and everything else. So this is the time of year when we need to kind of raise some funds. So we'll probably try to have an event relatively soon. If anybody would like to make a donation, you can do so via PayPal. Tim at SpookySouthCoast.com. Just go in there and make a donation. You can do that by sending money to friends and family, and we'll put that money toward the show's bills. But, we generally try and be self-sufficient these days. We spent a few years where we would we called ourselves the PBS of paranormal radio for a while because we'd have a pledge drive every year at the beginning of the year asking folks to donate because we do pay for all of this stuff out of our own pocket. But when we are able to put on events, and that kind of takes care of things. But it's been a little slow going this year with everybody's schedules, so we wouldn't mind a few donations if you want to make it. If you want to get something back for your money, well, just go to Spooky South Coast, click on .com, click on the store, and we have all kinds of Spooky South Coast merchandise there for sale. A lot of people sending me photos. They got Spooky South Coast T-shirts for Christmas, so we're pretty happy about that. We thank everybody out there who has supported the show over the years, whether it be from donating or even just tuning in and listening and spreading the word. We think we have a call here. Let's see if we can take it real fast. Good evening. You're on Spooky South Coast.
What's good?
Hello.
How you been, fella? Hey,
how you been, Lamone? Lamone, I'm going to put you on a clock because I have a guest calling in on this line in a few moments.
Well, all right. Next, I guess I know when you can come to Vegas. The Flower Alley next year in March, and in May, they're going to have Colas Colon. They're going to put them in Hall of Fame. So
yep.
Maybe that'd be time you come to Vegas.
Maybe
pretty good.
My dad was talking to me about trying to go out to Vegas. So I was like, well, if I'll go with you, you guys go to Vegas, I'll go to Pahrump and I'll visit KNYE. But if I go out there, I'll definitely
go to Kate.
Yeah, I'll definitely look you up if I go out there.
Well, I hope I'll talk to you before this, Playboy.
Oh yeah,
like
we're talking later on in the year.
I'll go back. Who's guest tonight?
We're going to be talking with Mark Cushman and Vic Mignogna about Star Trek.
Oh. All right, I got something to say about that. I'll call back while they're on there. Okay, Playboy?
All right, take it easy.
All right, play on, player.
You as well.
buddy. Bye-bye.
Yeah, that'll be an interesting... can you imagine that? Listen, I'm going to make a promise to everybody out there now. Well, I'll make this promise assuming I'll have good cell signal. But if I go out to Vegas and I hook up with Lamone and we decide to do some crazy stuff out there, I will absolutely live stream it on the Spooky South Coast Facebook page, or maybe on my Facebook page. I don't know. It depends on how much I want law enforcement to be able to track us down after the fact. But I think that would be that'd be a little... Well, at the very least, there'd be witnesses. It'd be the best reason to do that. But we can do that for sure if I head out there. I will absolutely do everything in my power to make sure that we live stream if there's anything going on out there. All right, good evening. You're on Spooky South Coast.
Hello there. This is Vic Mignana.
Hi, Vic. Great to connect with you. And I'm just going to, hold on, I'm going to lock you in so that we don't lose you. All right.
No worries.
All right. Now, you are locked in, and we are on the air, and we'll just wait a moment here for Mark to check in. But before that, let's just introduce everybody to you. It's Mignona, right?
Mignana, like tomorrow in Spanish.
Okay, Mignana. Vic Mignana is a veteran voice actor for more than 300 animated series and video games. He also is a longtime music composer, producer, and performer, and the executive producer of the highly popular web series Star Trek Continues, where he also plays Captain Kirk. And he joins us tonight on Spooky South Coast. And thank you, Vic, for checking in with us and joining the program. We're very excited to talk with you about something that I'm guessing is probably pretty near and dear to your heart with Star Trek.
Oh, you are definitely correct about that. It's a pleasure to join you.
Well, how did you first discover Star Trek? Was it, I think most of us, at least those of us who didn't watch the original series on TV, most of us discovered it through reruns. Is that how you found it?
Yeah, you're exactly right. The show had just gone off the air. I was 7 years old when the show went off the air. And I discovered it when I was 9 years old. So it had just gone into syndication. And my mom and I had just moved into a little apartment. We had a 19-inch black and white television that sat on the floor in the living room because we didn't even have a table for it. And I would come home every day from school at 5 p.m. and watch Star Trek, the original series, and I fell in love with Captain Kirk and Spock and McCoy and the stories and everything about that show just inspired me to basically do things that I'd never done before. Build things, make props, make costumes, wanted to round the kids up in the neighborhood and make little movies, little Star Trek episodes, build models and hang them in front of black poster board and run past them with the camera to make it look like the ship was flying through space. I was really inspired. That show really jump-started my creativity. And I went on to develop all of those production, acting, creative skills, and then several decades later, decided to create a web series to celebrate and pay tribute to the original series that I loved so much.
So it sounds like it wasn't just the characters and the story and the idea of having this adventure out in space that drew you. It sounds like the filmmaking aspects of it kind of grabbed you right away as well.
Well, I think I learned the filmmaking aspects so that I could tell the stories, so that I could learn how to do what they were doing. I had never acted before in my life, but at 10, 11, 12 years old, I wanted to do what Shatner and Nimoy and DeForest Kelley, I wanted to do what they were doing. I wanted to move people the way they moved me. So I started auditioning for school plays and church productions and community theater. It was Star Trek, my love of Star Trek, that got me started in acting. And then when I went away to high school and college, I majored in film so that I could learn, how to, all the technical elements of how to do what they were doing.
What was probably can you remember the first episode of Star Trek that you watched? Or
I do. As a matter of fact, it's funny you should ask. I remember the first episode I saw was a third season episode called The Tholian Web.
Oh, yeah.
And you know what's really special about that is that fast forward to our series, Star Trek Continues, and a few years back, I was contacted by Judy Burns, who wrote The Tholian Web. And she told me that she had a sequel idea, and she loved our series and wanted to pitch this idea. And we went on to make that episode. It was our 8th episode, Still Treads the Shadow. And it was written by Judy Burns, who wrote The Tholian Web.
It's so funny that's the episode that drew you in, because when I think I turned 11 or 12, my dad, for my birthday, is one of my gifts. He gave me this, video cassette shaped package, and I unwrapped it and I opened it up, and it was Star Trek, and it was that episode, The Tholian Web.
Oh my That's great.
And it was, you know how they started, like they would put them out as VHS that you could order and you get like one episode a month or whatever. He just got me the one episode because he's like, I don't know if you're going to like this. I don't know if it's something you're into, but I used to watch it when I was younger and I thought you'd want to check it out. And so that was also the episode that first drew me in as well.
Oh, that's amazing. And you know what? When I fell in love with Star Trek, there were no video cassettes. We're talking, 70, 71, 72. And I used to take a cassette recorder. I had a portable cassette recorder, and I would sit it beside the television speaker and record the episodes on audio cassette. And then I would put the cassette player under my pillow at night and listen to episodes as I went to sleep. And consequently, as you can imagine, I literally memorized the episodes word for word, sound effect for sound effect, music cue for music cue. I had a trumpet case that I took the trumpet out of, and I partitioned it up into 3 segments, and it was for the 3 seasons of Star Trek. And that trumpet case is still in my mother's attic today, with all of those cassettes, with my little scribblings of the name of the episodes on the cassettes.
Wow. Now you said, you would watch it after school. Was it on every weekday? Is that how they used to air it then?
It was. It was on WIIC in Pittsburgh, Channel 11, every day. And I would come home, get home from school around 3:30 or 4, and do whatever homework I could do, and then lay down on the floor at 5 p.m. and set my cassette player up and record the episodes. And, then when the models came out, whether it was the Enterprise model or the Bridge, or remember that model of Mr. Spock firing a phaser at the 3-headed lizard?
Oh, yeah.
I, had all those things. I had the Miko action figures. My mother would tell you I was obsessed, but in a good way. Like I said, it really inspired me to do a lot of the things that I do professionally today. And about 6 years ago, I wanted to I had worked with some other Star Trek fan productions, and they left me walking away thinking, this could be done so much better. If somebody who actually knew how to shoot, how to light, how to edit, how to act, how to write a good story, how to choose just the right music cues, all of the elements of production, if somebody were able to do that, they could do it at a much higher level. And so that's what I set out to do with Star Trek Continues. We made one episode that I funded, and with a friend of mine, Stephen Dengler. And after we made that episode, we released it, not really knowing if anyone would like it or not, but people really responded to it. And so from that point on, we launched crowdfunding campaigns to make the other 10 episodes. And for your listeners that don't know, our series picks up right where the original series was canceled, and it finishes the 5-year mission of the Enterprise.
Wow.
Our 2-part finale ends right where the motion picture begins.
That's amazing. And those stories must have been building up in you over the years, though, because, as you mentioned, watching it every day after school, only 3 seasons, it's not going to take that long to go through them all and rerun. So you're going to see the same episodes over and over and over again. So, you must have been thirsting for new adventure. So you're making them up in your mind. You had all that time to kind of put together some of these stories.
Well, that's true. But also, not only that, but, when you're talking about a Star Trek, especially classic Star Trek, when you're talking about a Star Trek story, what made the original series so unique and still so topical today is that they told morality plays. You know what I mean? They told stories that had a theme. They had a message. They had a point to make. They had a lesson to tell. They had a social issue to address. And they did it in an imaginative, creative story, in a setting that was, original and sci-fi. That's how Roddenberry got away with telling a lot of the stories that he told, was by couching them in these imaginative stories off other worlds. So I've seen a lot, like I said, I've seen a lot of other Star Trek fan productions, and most fan productions are limited to, we beamed down and we flipped open communicators and we fired phasers and we did all the kind of the fan things. But when it comes to really writing a topical story like Star Trek, like the original series stories, you're really setting the bar very high. And fortunately, myself and I had several other really great people like James Kerwin and Rob Sawyer, Lisa Hansel, Ralph Miller, Matt Busey, several people that worked together to dig up really cool ideas and write stories that made you feel like you were watching episodes that were locked in a vault somewhere for 50 years.
And that's where it becomes hard, I think, for a lot of the writers who came on to some of the other Star Trek projects in the years that followed. I think it was kind of hard for them to find that same voice that Gene Roddenberry had in the original series of looking to take these issues of the day and kind of mask them in other ways. It almost became that the universe of Star Trek grew so much that there were so many other stories to serve. But when you're talking about the Enterprise crew on their original mission, you can kind of focus on the dynamic of that crew, the people that made it up, and the way that those morality lessons would come into play when they would interact with other species.
Yes, and it wasn't just social issues. It was issues like... for me, like for our series, it wasn't just social issues like slavery or sex trafficking or racism or immigration, but it was also concepts of self-sacrifice, concepts of selflessness, concepts of courage, noble, let's put it that way, the more nobler qualities of humanity. Not the darker underbelly and the seedy dystopian sci-fi stuff, but much more noble virtues and things that you would watch and it would inspire you to be a better person. We have no shortage of media today that drags our morality down, that it literally appeals to our baser instincts. So one of the things that I loved about classic Star Trek and that I tried to capture in my series was the more noble elements and virtues of humanity.
And you can tell that it's done in a different way because if you look at some of the series of today, okay, so one of the big series that just came out recently was Watchmen on HBO. Very overt themes that reflect the times of today. Very overt connections to what's going on in the world. And a lot of people kind of turned against the show because of it. They said, this show is too political. I'm trying to escape everything. And this show is trying to talk to me about the same thing I would have seen if I watched CNN. But with Star Trek, they did the same thing, but they did it in a way where the storytelling was so good and where you cared so much about the characters that it didn't become preachy. It didn't become like that. It became... it just became a way. You didn't even know you were walking away with this with a lesson.
Exactly. And you know what we did with our series, and I think the original series really created the blueprint for this. We didn't treat the audience like they were stupid. The original series appealed to the intellect of the audience, and it didn't necessarily bang you over the head with one particular viewpoint, which is all too common in today's media. Whoever's producing a show or directing a show is, like you said, beating you over the head with their politics or their philosophies. But what Star Trek would do, and what we did with Star Trek Continues, was we would write a story where we would present both sides of a very complex issue. We would have people that represented voices on both sides of the issue, and then we would present them respectfully and intellectually and let the audience, let the viewer use their own noodle and decide what they think is right, what they believe. And I think that was part of the magic of Star Trek.
It really was. And I guess part of it is you can say, maybe because we believed in the same topics and the same perspective and point of view that Star Trek had, that we can look at it as being this just kind of this positive force. But I think I really can't think anybody would walk away from Star Trek being against the moral lessons that it was trying to teach. You can be against the moral lessons that, Watchmen or some of these more modern series are trying to teach you, but you're not going to be against what you see in Star Trek. It's the basic outline of it, of the whole thing. Is just be a good person and be a good member of the universe.
That makes very good sense. You're exactly right. All of our episodes, we tried to follow that formula, but our 9th episode in particular comes to mind because it was an immigration kind of story. It was topical, obviously, but in the writing of the story, we had people on both sides of the issue, and they presented very, very compelling arguments for why they had the position they had. So, rather than one person saying, open borders is wrong, the end, you have to believe what I believe or you're a moron. Instead of taking that kind of a hard-nosed, heavy-handed position, somebody on the other side would say, well, look, here's the reasons why we have, the beliefs that we do and the laws that we do, and it makes good sense. So it appeals to you intellectually, and you come, maybe even hopefully you walk away understanding a little more both sides of some of these very complex issues.
And so just real quick, before we get into the discussion with Mark, how can people find Star Trek Continues?
Just that easy. StarTrekContinues.com. We have 11 full-length episodes, and here's the best part. It's all free. We made this we didn't make this to make a penny from it. We didn't make it for any profit. We made it to we made it to celebrate and pay tribute to this series that we loved so much. So there are 11 full-length episodes. We've got over 10 million viewers now, and we've won over a dozen awards. It's a great cast, a great crew. We've got a lot of amazing guest stars in every episode, and it's all available for free to watch, including behind the scenes, making of, blooper videos, all kinds of wonderful stuff. It's all free at StarTrekContinues.com.
Well, we'll talk more about Star Trek Continues throughout the course of the night, but let's bring in now our other guest, Mark Cushman. He's an author and LA-based screenwriter and director. His television writing assignments include scripts for Star Trek The Next Generation, Beyond Belief, Fact or Fiction, and Diagnosis Murder. His feature film credits include Desperately Seeking Paul McCartney, The Magic of Christmas, and In the Eyes of a Killer. So we'll talk to him about that and some of his other work as well. Mark Cushman, good evening.
Hi, Tim. How are you?
We are doing well. I'm just going to lock you in here so I don't drop you by accident. All right. We've been talking a little bit with Vic about Star Trek, but I'd like to get some of your thoughts as well. And I'm going to start with the same question. How did you happen upon the world of Star Trek?
Well, that was way back in 1967 when I caught the reruns for the first season on NBC, and I was about 10. And everybody at school was talking about Star Trek. But I lived up on a dairy farm in Oregon, and we couldn't get the NBC affiliate during the winter and the fall. But it would kind of fizzle in during the summer months. And so the first episode I saw was the repeat of The Devil in the Dark, the one about the Horta. And I was hooked instantly. And many, many years later, I met Gene Roddenberry and did some work for him. And then when Next Generation went on, he brought me in, and I pitched some stories to them. One of them was Sarek, which was in the early part of the third season, where we see Spock's father on Next Generation, which was the first episode that really tied the first two shows together. And I talked to Gene at that time about, actually a little bit earlier, about if he had saved all the files to all the episodes, because I always loved a book called The Making of Star Trek, which came out in 1968 while the show was in production. And it mostly focused on the pilots and getting the show started. And I said, did you keep those kind of records for all the episodes? And he did. And he showed me 40-something big boxes filled with tens of thousands of memos and production schedules and scripts and everything. And so he allowed me to access all that material. And I created this 3-volume book set. These are the Voyages, season 1, 2, and 3, and each chapter's got about 20 pages with a lot of these memos in there, and the productions and the budgets, and I interviewed everybody, so they all tell the story either through the interviews I got or better from the actual memos when they were doing the show. And we also licensed all the Nielsen ratings for every single episode, breaking a lot of the folklore about the ratings on Star Trek. It did very respectably on NBC, but NBC didn't like the show. They didn't like Gene Roddenberry. They were fighting about stories, and that's what led it to being moved to different time slots, worse time slots, finally the death slot during its third year when it was canceled.
And so that's what it was. It came down to the stories that Roddenberry was trying to tell, and that's why NBC wanted to kill the show.
Yeah, it was a big fight because Gene wanted to do stories about Vietnam, about sexism, racism, God, religions of all kind, and you didn't do that back then on primetime entertainment television. And the memos are so dramatic, the fights between him and NBC over these episodes. And the ratings are in the first season when it was on Thursday nights from 8:30 to 9:30. It quite often won its time slot. It was NBC's highest-rated show of the night. They almost canceled it. A letter-writing campaign kicked in, so they renewed it. They put it on Friday nights. Not a great night for Star Trek. All the kids and all the teenagers the kids are in bed. The teenagers are out. The college kids are out. So the ratings dropped down, but it was still NBC's top-rated Friday night show. They tried to cancel it again. They got 1 million protest letters, so they pushed it to the death slot, 10 to 11 Fridays. And the opening episode, Spock's Brain, not a favorite of most Star Trek fans, won its time slot against Judd for the Defense, which was the Emmy-winning show from the previous year, Best Dramatic Series, and the 2-hour premiere of Hawaii Five-0, which ran for 12 years. The ratings did come down during the third season because of that terrible time slot. But the folklore began that NBC canceled it just because of the ratings. That's not the case. They did come down towards the end, but in the first couple of years, it was winning their time slots for the network.
It also explains why all the letter-writing campaigns didn't work either.
Yeah, well, they did work for the first and second year. The third season, NBC was prepared because they'd gotten 1 million letters and petitions the previous year. It embarrassed them. They had to pick it up. And because how do you explain to your stockholders that we're canceling the top-rated show of the night? So they put it in that killer slot, and then they prepared for the write-in at the end of the third season. And they sent out form letters to deceive the fans. They took it off in February of '69, and they were going to put it back on later in the summer for 12 repeats. So when all the fans started writing in saying, please don't cancel this, they sent out a form letter saying, don't worry, Star Trek will be returning to the NBC schedule, which was not a lie, but it was deceptive. And that kind of tapered off the write-ins. It was still a very strong write-in campaign at the end of the third year, but it deflected it enough where they were able to get rid of the show. 2 years later, NBC wanted it back in prime time because the reruns were killing them.
I was going to say, yeah, wasn't there a movement toward a second series very early on after the rerun started?
Yeah. Throughout the 1970s, I just did a book series. The first volume's out. The second one comes out in a few months. And it's Gene Roddenberry and Star Trek in the 1970s. And it shows that entire groundswell that was coming up during the 1970s as Star Trek was gaining even more popularity in reruns. And all the protests that were going on, the conventions started up, everything was happening. And everybody was wondering, why don't we have Star Trek back in prime time? It's on 5 nights a week in every city across the country, winning its time slots. Why isn't it on the network? Well, the network wanted it back. 2 years after they canceled, NBC was begging Paramount to give it back to them. And those memos are in these books, and you see all that action going on. But Paramount did not want to put it back into production because, first, the ratings were doing so well in the reruns, they didn't want to risk turning that apple cart over. You know, they thought, hey, if we start making new episodes, it may drop, the bottom may drop out of the rerun package. The second reason was they had torn down all the sets, destroyed all the props, all the costumes. They'd given the giant 12-foot Enterprise miniature to the Smithsonian Institute and the Klingon ship. And so they knew it was going to cost a fortune to rebuild all this stuff. So they told NBC, if you want the show back, we have to have a 1, maybe even a 2-year commitment from you. And the network wanted the show back, but they weren't willing to give that commitment, not until 1977, when they started putting together Phase 2, which became Star Trek: The Motion Picture. At that point, NBC said, we'll give you a year's commitment. And they said, no, we're going to use it to launch a fourth network. That didn't happen, but we got the movie.
Well, I do want to dig into some of that, too. We have a few minutes here before we'll have to take a break for the news, but in the second hour, we can really do a deep dive into a lot of this stuff because I only recently discovered all the information about Phase 2 and about, trying to launch that Paramount network and the way they were going to try to put everything together. And then, from what I understand, the original movie wasn't even, that was supposed to be the plot for the series, but the original plan that Roddenberry wanted to explore for a motion picture was actually Star Trek 6, and to explore the God question in the first movie coming out. And they said, we don't know if we can do that. And then they did it anyway, really.
They brought him in 1975, Paramount, and he wrote a script that is commonly known now as The God Thing. It was just called Star Trek 2, but it was later published as a paperback called The God Thing. And Paramount didn't want to do it. They were afraid it would offend a lot of people of certain religions, and so they rejected his script. He wrote a second script. They rejected it with a form letter, and then they started hiring all these other writers to write a movie. I mean, they treated Gene Roddenberry terribly. And so by 1977, they had not found a script that they were happy with, and so they said, let's just do it as a TV show. And that was Phase 2. And they were days away from filming. They had already had 13 episodes written, plus a 2-hour premiere episode called In Thy Image. And that became Star Trek: The Motion Picture. And the reason the new series didn't get on the air, Vic ended up doing it, but for Star Trek Continues. But the reason it didn't get on the air back then was because they were trying to use it as the flagship to sell a fourth network. And everybody wanted Star Trek. They had 180 affiliates across the United States, more than NBC had, willing to take the new Star Trek series. Everyone wanted it, but they didn't want the rest of the programming Paramount was trying to put together. So they had already invested all this money rebuilding the sets, buying scripts, signing all the actors to contracts, and they said, and Star Wars came out right at that moment, and they said, you know what, let's just grab this 2-hour premiere episode and make it as a movie. And that became Star Trek: The Motion Picture.
Well, we can talk more about that coming up, but it just in the couple minutes we have left here, Vic, as a fan growing up, I mean, did you hear about some of this stuff happening and about some of these wheels that were in motion before the motion picture came out?
No, I didn't. And first of all, hi, Mark.
Hi, Vic.
I did not. I did not know about much of that until Star Trek: The Motion Picture came out. And then that was when I started hearing rumblings of how there was supposed to be a new TV series that ended up not happening, and they decided to go with the theatrical release instead. But no, I did not know about a lot of that. I didn't know why the show was canceled. You know, in reading the audiobook, which I know we're going to get into in a bit, I learned so much about the making of the show, and not just that, but the challenges of making the show. And, one thing that Mark didn't get a chance to mention yet, but not only did the network not like Roddenberry and the way he was pushing ideals and social issues and stuff, but the series cost so much money to make. They were regularly over budget. And even Lucy, who owned the studio at the time, her board of directors told her, "Don't make this show, Lucy. It's going to bankrupt you. It'll bankrupt your studio." But Lucy was determined to come up with something new and fresh, something that had not been done before, something that wasn't a police show or a Western, which was basically most of what was on television at the time.
Or a sitcom, which is what Desilu was known for making.
Right, exactly. And so she pressed forward with Star Trek, and it was so costly to make. If you just think about the logistics of not only the special effect shots required with spaceships and phasers and stuff and beaming down that no cowboy Western would ever need, but also every week they're going to a different planet. Or a different species, or different, world where they've got different ships and costumes and sets, and it was just terribly expensive to make.
Well, we'll talk more about that coming up in the next hour. We'll also talk more about the individual work of Mark and Vic, and we'll talk about the project that they've been working on together as well. We'll also open up the phone lines a little bit later on for Star Trek questions from the audience at 508-996-0500, 877-996-1420 if you would like to call in. That's the best way to reach us with any questions tonight. Of course, you can also join us in the chat room on Spooky TV at SpookySouthcoast.com and on YouTube. But if you have a question that you want to ask there, please try and put it all in capital letters because I'm the only one monitoring the chat room while I'm running everything else tonight. So I want to try and see that as much as we can. You know, you can also, use the, if you want to do it the other way, you can do it with email. That's a good way to do it. Tim at SpookySouthcoast.com. I'll make sure that I try and check that as much as I can through the show as well. All right, we are going to take a break. We'll come back with more with Mark Cushman and Vic Mignogna as we talk more about Star Trek here on Spooky South Coast. along with science advisor Matt Mo. Here. Reitman, good evening. Back here on WBSM after spooky. Good evening and welcome.
Intrigued by paranormal talk radio? You'll love the new Paranormal Radio app from TalkStream Live. You'll find a great selection of talk shows covering UFOs, ghosts, strange phenomena, and much more. Download the Paranormal Radio app now and start listening to the very best in paranormal talk entertainment. The Paranormal Radio app, free in Google Play and the iOS App Store.
Welcome back. Hour number 2 of Spooky Southcoast. Tim Weisberg here with you. No silent assassin Matt Costa. No science advisor Matt Moniz. No psychic medium Stephanie Burke. Just myself tonight as we are joined by our guests Mark Cushman and Vic Mignogna. We are talking about Star Trek tonight. They are both involved in the world of Star Trek. Mark is an author and a screenwriter who worked on Star Trek The Next Generation. And also Vic has a web series called Star Trek Continues, which you can check out online. As we were discussing in the first hour, it picks up where the original series leaves off and continues the rest of that 5-year mission before we get to Star Trek The Motion Picture. And we were actually discussing right before the news break there, we were talking about the period of time when it looked like Star Trek was trying to come back as a series with the Phase 2 project. And Mark, we were talking a little bit about that. Just for people's edification, what was the idea behind that series? It was going to be very similar to what Vic's series is all about.
Almost identical. They were actually using a slightly modified version of the uniforms from the original show. The ship was pretty much the same. The bridge had a little more new stuff on it, plus 2 turbolifts. Engineering was expanded. They had everybody coming back except Leonard Nimoy, and they had a new Vulcan, a young Vulcan, who was going to be in his place. And everyone was signed up. They had 13 scripts written, a 2-hour premiere episode, and they were days away from beginning filming when the plug was pulled because Paramount was having trouble selling their 4th network. They weren't having trouble selling Star Trek. They had 180-plus affiliates that wanted to pick it up. They just didn't want the other programming. So that 2-hour movie became Star Trek The Motion Picture.
What was the decision behind Leonard Nimoy not coming back?
He wasn't available. He wanted to do it, and there was a lot of nasty rumors going around that he was dismissing Star Trek because he had put out a book called I Am Not Spock, which was not anti-Star Trek at all. It was him talking to the character of Spock through most of the book, and the things he had learned from Spock and taken into himself as an actor and so forth. But because of that book coming out and the fact that he wasn't going to be part of the show, everybody thought that he didn't want to play Spock again. That was not true. He was actually doing a play in New York on Broadway, which prevented him from being available when they were going to start filming. And he was also under contract to do Invasion of the Body Snatchers with Donald Sutherland. So that was not going to allow him to do it. Now, when the TV series was canceled, when it didn't go forward, and they decided to take that 2-hour premiere episode, make it into a movie, that pushed it back a few months, and that allowed Nimoy to come aboard.
Now, Vic, were you aware of Phase 2 when you came up with the idea for Star Trek Continues?
Well, I mean, I knew about Phase 2, back, like I said, I heard about it for the first time back when Star Trek The Motion Picture came out. We're talking about, 79? 10 years after the original series was canceled. But, I mean, that was.
But, I mean, did you know what they were thinking about doing with the storyline that,
No, I didn't.
So.
No, in fact, my idea for Star Trek Continues was that the original series never got a proper ending. The original series began, as you know, every week, every episode, Captain Kirk would say, these are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. It's 5-year mission. Mm-hmm. Well, they didn't have a 5-year mission. They were canceled in their 3rd television season. And then the next time anyone saw those characters again was Star Trek the Motion Picture 10 years later. By then, the uniforms have changed. Kirk's become an admiral. He's taken a promotion. Spock has gone back to Vulcan. Everyone's gone their own separate ways. So my idea was, let's pick it up right where it was canceled, and tell stories, craft a story for these characters that explains why everyone is where they are when the motion picture begins. Return the Enterprise to Earth, explain why the Enterprise goes into dry dock, why does Spock go back to Vulcan, why does Kirk, who loves his ship more than anything, why would he ever accept a promotion and a desk job?
Yeah.
So to me,
that's
these
your
were all
finale
compelling
episode.
stories
What
that
Vic
needed to
did
be
before
told.
then was he did what would have been the 4th and 5th season.
Exactly.
Sample it with 11 episodes, and then he had this 2-part finale, which takes them back to Earth at the end of the 5-year mission, and that sets the stage for Star Trek the Motion Picture.
Mark, in your work with Gene Roddenberry, did you ever ask him why it was originally set out to be a 5-year mission?
Absolutely. And John D.F. Black confirmed this. He was the associate producer on the first year. When John D.F. Black and Gene Roddenberry wrote the opening narration, and it was John who came up with Space, the Final Frontier, they said 5 years because they were hoping for a 5-year run on the network, which would give them enough episode for a good, strong rerun package.
So it worked out anyway, though. I think the reruns worked out even without 5 years.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Yeah, back then they thought you needed 100-plus episodes. Well, we got 79. But Star Trek was so popular, and people loved it so much. Part of this new book series that I've done that covers the 1970s is reading the press that was coming out during that period, and they kept comparing it to Beatlemania. They could not believe that people were watching these episodes 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times and counting and loving them more and more each time they watched them. It got stronger and stronger, which, you got to give some credit to Lucille Ball, as Vic was saying earlier. She told her board of directors, bring me a show that we can own, like I Love Lucy, which is what built Desilu. And they were filming all these other shows for other production companies, like the Andy Griffith Show, Dick Van Dyke, Danny Thomas, and so on. But they didn't own those shows. She wanted to own a show that she could put into reruns for 10 years. And I Love Lucy at that point had been rerunning for about 10 years. And they brought her Star Trek. And she believed in it. So even as Vic mentioned, when the board of directors was saying, no, don't do it. It's going to be too expensive. It'll kill us. It'll bankrupt us. She stuck by it. And it did bankrupt them. And that's why halfway through the second season, Lucy had to sell Desilu to Paramount Pictures. And when Paramount came in, they cut the budgets. And that's why the third season doesn't stand up as well to the first and second. Lots of good episodes. One of Vic's favorites is from the third year. But they didn't have the budget. So they couldn't have the guest stars. They couldn't have as many days to film the shows and so forth. So you do see a little drop in quality. But they were still trying the best they could.
Now, I heard a rumor, and I could never find anything to kind of substantiate this. Maybe you guys know a little bit more about this, but I heard that Desilu told the independent stations that weren't really necessarily sold on Star Trek reruns because it was such a short syndication package. I heard a rumor that in order to get the I Love Lucy reruns, they had to take Star Trek as well.
No, that's not true.
Okay.
There's a lot of folklore out there about Star Trek. They didn't have any problem selling it in syndication, because the ratings were, as I said, much better than what we had been led to believe. Back then, you didn't publish the ratings routinely in trade magazines and so forth. They might list the top 10 shows. It was like just maybe twice a year during sweeps that Broadcasting Magazine or Variety might print the entire lineup. But Star Trek was right in the middle. It wasn't at the bottom. And even though it was in the middle out of 90 primetime TV shows, it was the top-rated show on NBC on the nights they were showing it. A network does not cancel their top-rated show. That's the one you keep. But they kept trying to get rid of it because of the script problems they were having. I mean, think of one in particular that some of your listeners may remember, The Enemy Within, from the first season, where a transporter malfunction splits Kirk into two, and one is the intellect and the other is the primal side. And the primal Kirk tries to rape his yeoman. He pins her to the ground. He's on top of her. She has to scratch his face to get him off of her. And NBC was very concerned about that script, and Roddenberry promised them in these memos that we published in the book, and you can read them, is that, and Vic reads them in the audiobook, along with his cast of 80. They told Stan Robertson at NBC, no, it's not going to be a rape. He's just getting frisky with her. He's just being forward with her. Well, anyone who's seen that episode, that's an attempted rape all the way. And what happened is during the first half hour of that episode, it was winning its time slot, as it often did. And right when that attempted rape took place, it dropped to number 3 for the rest of the hour. And there's a memo in that particular chapter in the first season book where NBC writes to Gene Roddenberry and says, we will not rerun this episode. Don't you ever do this to us again. Well, it was those type of fights that caused the friction between Gene Roddenberry and NBC.
And it wasn't just, we talked a little bit about this with Vic before you joined us, Mark, but it wasn't just, some of the controversial things that they were pushing and some of the controversial themes and trying to tackle the Vietnam War and racism and things like that. Star Trek just tried to be a little bit more forward-thinking, and some of that forward-thinking was shaking up Middle America. I mean, we could talk all day about the interracial kiss, but just having crew members in miniskirts was scandalous enough in some parts of the country.
That was America's first look at the micro-mini, or even the regular mini. The miniskirt came out in the summer of 1966 in England, in London. We hadn't seen it over here. So when Star Trek premiered in September of 1966, nobody had ever seen that much leg on network TV unless you were watching the Jackie Gleason show with the June Taylor dancers. So it was really a very sexy show, a very controversial show, and a very challenging show in every way that you can imagine. And that was just went against the grain of what the networks were willing to show back then.
And it was also portraying women in a different way than we'd seen them before. They weren't housewives and they weren't secretaries. The women that were involved in the crew of the Enterprise were equal to the men. I mean, obviously everybody has their own rank, but still there was no differentiation between men and women when it came to, just how much of a say they had in things.
That's right. It was just 1 year before Star Trek that I Spy went on NBC, and that was the first show to have a white and a black actor cast on equal status, and a black actor playing a non-stereotypical role. Before that, we had, Rochester on the Jack Benny Show, and we had Amos and Andy, and we had Beulah, which was a sitcom like Hazel, but it was a black maid working for rich white people. And so Star Trek gave us an Asian helmsman, it gave us a Russian navigator, it gave us a black communication officer, it gave us a Vulcan science officer, and on, and put women into these command positions. Matter of fact, in the first pilot, Majel Barrett played number 1, who was the second officer, the first officer, but the second in command of the Enterprise. And NBC didn't want that, so she ended up becoming Nurse Chapel in the TV show.
It seems to me, I've had the opportunity to meet some of the cast members from the original series through my work at Rhode Island Comic-Con, and it seems to me like they understand now the impact that Star Trek had on the rest of the country.
Yeah.
Were they experiencing that as it aired? Did they understand that they were part of this important work?
Oh, yeah. Gene knew he was doing something nobody had ever done. He had produced a show before that called The Lieutenant, and he did an episode called, what was the name of it? I can't remember the episode, but it dealt with racism in the U.S. military, and NBC refused to air it. They did air it, which the internet gets wrong, but it did air because Gene called civil rights groups, and they picketed NBC and forced the network to put it on, but then NBC canceled the show. So he wanted to do a show where he could tell those kind of stories and show an interracial crew and show equal sex and everything else on Star Trek. They knew they were doing something nobody else had done. We just lost Dorothy Fontana a couple weeks ago, D.C. Fontana. She had to use the initials D.C. because no women were writing that kind of stuff. Action, adventure, science fiction back then. And so she had to use her initials to get scripts sold. But they all knew it was so unique, and I also have in these books a lot of the fan letters that were coming in 1966 and 67 and 68 and 69, And you just see people blown away by this show and what it was doing. And then from the memos from the network, you see how they were threatened because they're getting letters from other people who don't want to see that.
And Vic, how do you try to keep that spirit alive when you start putting out Star Trek Continues? How do you look at what Gene Roddenberry and his writers were able to do and say, now I want to be able to apply that to my series as well?
Well, I think, when I watched the show, I just absorbed it. You know what I mean? I took it in and I thought about it and I quoted it and I reflected on it. And, I know that a lot of people out there had the same feeling about it I did. I mean, it affected them exactly the same way it affected me. And so when I wanted to make this web series, I knew that there were a lot of other web series and a lot of other fan-driven productions that had been made, but I set the bar at telling really compelling stories. And if you want to tell really compelling, thought-provoking stories, you have to have a good script. And if you have a good script, you have to have good actors to be able to communicate that script. There are any number of places along the way where the production can kind of suffer, where it can kind of break down. But we had so many great people working with Star Trek Continues, people that not only loved what they did, and not only did they love Star Trek, but they were experts in their fields. They were very qualified camera operators, or lighting people, or prop people, or wardrobe people, or writers. And what we all had in common was a very, very great passion for the spirit of the original series.
Something else, Tim, is I've said this before in interviews, and it's absolutely true. In all the years that I was writing scripts and going in for pitch meetings at different TV shows and so forth, no producer ever asked me what the theme of my story was. You just kind of pitch a hook to them, and they say, "Oh, I like that. Go do it." When I pitched to Gene Roddenberry and pitched Sarlacc to him, he loved the idea of a story about a Vulcan going through senility. But then he said, "But what's the theme?" Unfortunately, I had one, and I was able to talk to him about that. But that's also in all these memos, is you see them talking about what is this particular episode about? What are we trying to communicate to the audience? And that's one of the things that keeps Star Trek alive to this day. It's an excellent cast. It was state-of-the-art production for its time. They're great stories, but they have a great theme, a great message. And all the years that I was doing this, he was the only one who ever asked me that. And I saw that he asked every single writer that same question. And then finally, all these years later, I found another producer who asked me that question. And you're talking to him, Vic Mignogna. When I wrote a script for
I was going to say, that's exactly what that's what I asked him. When we started our series, Tim, we had dozens and dozens of people who submitted ideas. And, if you get 2 or 3 pages into a script and you still don't know what in the world it's about, it's probably not a good script.
Right.
And so I started, when people would say I have an idea or I have a script, I would say, well, don't send me a script. Send me 1 page and tell me what it's about. What's the theme? What's the point? What are you trying to say? And we had probably over 100 script submissions during our 5-year run. Ironically, we had a 5-year mission of our own. And almost all of them didn't really have a message. They were, Captain Kirk beams down to the planet, and he fights the Klingons, and, they were just very shallow. So like I said, whenever you decide that you want to create a classic Star Trek type story, you're setting very high.
Absolutely.
Hey, by the way, Tim, I'd love to go back. I'd love to go back and chime in on something you were talking about a minute ago.
Sure.
You were talking about how the original series of Star Trek cast women in equal roles to men, and how groundbreaking that was. And you're right. It did. It it broke new ground and was revolutionary in that way. And it's ironic, isn't it, that in our day and age, in today's culture, in the culture we are living in right now, people look at the original series and like, oh, it's so sexist, and the women, you know, Captain Kirk, you know, is always making out with different women, and, you know, and they're all wearing short skirts, and it's so sexist. It's really interesting, isn't it, that this show that did such amazing, huge strides for women is now, you know, when you put it under the microscope of some of the culture today, you know, they find terrible fault with the fact that the women wore mini skirts, or, you know, the men protected the women, or that Kirk, you know, would kiss, you know, different women on different, you know, almost every other episode.
It was
it's really
a sexually free
that they
show,
broke
which
such
was very
ground
unusual
with
back then.
women,
It was ahead of
and
its
yet
time.
people
And I
were
got to tell you
Hold-
something
hold
about
on,
what
guys, we
Vic was just saying. It was not Gene Roddenberry's idea that they wear miniskirts, or the costume director. If you look at the pilots, they're wearing slacks, the women. And
Yep.
and it wasn't until the Corbett Maneuver, the first episode of the regular series, where you saw the miniskirt. It was Grace Lee Whitney, who played Yeoman Rand, who said, "I don't want to wear those pants. Can I wear a skirt?" And Nichelle Nichols said the same thing. And so they gave them these skirts, and Grace and Nichelle were both dancers, and they had great legs, and they both kept sneaking their skirts up when they would sit down to see which one of them could show more leg. It was the women who brought those miniskirts into the show.
Well, and that's the other thing, too, is people forget that, yeah, as much as Star Trek was trying to be forward-thinking for women and the roles that it saw them playing in a future world, you're also still talking to an audience of the 60s, too. And you're also still going to have to play into some of the tropes that they expect to find on a television show airing in the late 1960s.
Yeah. And I have a prediction. In 10 years, 20 years, you're going to see that kind of dress again. You know, everything goes in cycles. And so right now you have the whole politically correct movements that are trying to snuff all this stuff out and make us all be very much alike, unisex and everything else. But the pendulum's going to swing the other way in time, because the next generation always has to rebel against the previous generation. So anyone who thinks that, hey, we're changing the world and we're never going to go back to this, don't believe it.
So why don't we try to take a few calls here? I don't know how well it's going to be, because I can hear, like, you guys seem to be having a little bit of trouble hearing each other. So let's see if we can bring the callers in and see if we can get the questions asked. And if we run into some trouble, I'll just repeat the question. Good evening. You're on Spooky Southcoast with Vic and Mark. How are you?
Hello?
Hi. Do you have a question for our guests?
Yes, I do. It's regarding a certain episode. It was one in which the Enterprise was in the throes of a tractor beam and being drawn into a planet. It was, you know, they needed to break free of the tractor beam before they hit the planet's atmosphere. At that point, there'd be no return. And I call that episode the Voyager 1 episode, because I think the only name they got for what was trying to suck them into the planet was V'ger, and it turned out to be Voyager 1. That had been, you know, at that point, well, because it was set so far in the future that at that point Voyager 1 had been off in space and collected volumes and volumes of data, and had landed on this planet and needed to communicate it. Are you guys familiar with that episode?
Well, V'ger was actually in Star Trek: The Motion Picture, and there was an episode in the original series called The Changeling, where they encountered a Earth probe that had gone out to space and came back changed and was trying to sterilize people and so forth. So those two are a little bit similar. The episode you're thinking of is called The Apple, and it wasn't V'ger. It was what was his name?
Val.
Vic? Val? V-A-L, right? Val was the computer on the planet that put a tractor
Val.
beam around the
Can you hear
Enterprise
that?
and was pulling it
Yep.
down. And Kirk and the landing party was trapped on the planet, and he was trying to kill them off with the lightning bolts and everything else. So that was an episode called The Apple from the second season.
All right. Thank you very much for the call. And let's take this other call real fast. Good evening. You're on Spooky South Coast with Mark and Vic. Do you have a question?
Yes, how you doing, Timmy?
Good.
Right. So let me. I have a statement first. All right. So we talked about Lucille Ball. Okay. You know that when her and Desi Arnaz got married, he couldn't afford to buy a ring, so he got one of those cigar things and a beer tab and put beer ring back then, put it on her finger for a wedding ring. Eventually bought a new one, but bought a regular one. But when she died, that's the only thing she wanted to be buried with was that.
Oh, that's
and that's
nice.
just saying, after all the time they've been together and loved each other and stuff, they hated each other. She still loved them.
Right. No,
And
you must have a Star Trek question, Lamone.
Okay. And so I have a question about Star Trek. So now, one more thing about Star Trek. All right. So you notice how the skirts, you come up to being short, they went back to the same height of skirts they had with Shirley Temple. If you know the Shirley Temple films, that's how short her skirts were. That's like the Brady Bunch girls wore the same size skirts.
She was
I know
5 years old,
crazy,
though.
But it's the truth. And so, and it's like, personally, I remember hearing Michelle Nichols talk about how she was going to quit, on Star Trek, and Martin Luther King told us, "No, sister, you right there. You're letting everybody see a black woman, American black woman, in place of honor, in the place of position of value and stuff like that. Don't do that.
Right.
That's working against us." And so she decided to stay with it. She decided to stay and do it.
Well,
so I thought that was really good and touching and stuff like that. Some things you don't hear about everywhere else.
Sure.
That's because it's a spooky Southcoast.
All right. Thank you for the call, Lamone.
Right. Oh.
Is there some truth to that, Mark? About
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, Nichelle told me that story for my books, and she also talked about it in her autobiography. At the end of the first season, she was the only one who wasn't under a yearly contract. She was on a weekly contract.
Really?
So all the others had to come back, whether they wanted to or not, but they all wanted to. Nichelle was on a weekly contract because they didn't know when they signed her how much they were going to have for the communication officer to do. But they loved her so much, and she was so good, they just kept putting her in episodes. So at the end of the first season, she decided she was going to leave the show and pursue other things, because even though she had gotten some nice parts, she wasn't one of the more prominent characters in that first season in particular. And so she gave Gene Roddenberry a letter saying that she was going to leave. And then she went to, and I couldn't hear everything Ramon was saying, so I hope I'm not repeating something he said, but she went to a charity convention and a fundraising event, and Martin Luther King was there. And he said, "We watch you every week. I mean, you're one of the few black people. You and I Spy, those are the shows we watch." And she said, "Well, thank you very much, but I'll be leaving the show." And he said, "You cannot. You are the face of the future for blacks in America. You're not only a woman in a officer, but in outer space, an astronaut." And so she went back into Gene's office after thinking about it and being so impressed by Martin Luther King, and she said, "Okay, I'd like to stay on." And he said, "Okay, I'll give you your letter back." And he took it out of envelope out of his drawer, and he poured it on his desk, and he had torn it into pieces.
All right, let's take another phone call real quick. Good evening. You're next on Spooky South Coast with Mark and Vic.
Hey, Tim, it's John. Vic's got a couple of years on me, but I discovered Star Trek in reruns in the 80s, early 80s. And my mother, I used to think she was a Star Trek fan, but when The Next Generation and the other series and the movies came around, I discovered she was just a Kirk, Spock, and McCoy fan, which is okay, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But I love the Sarek episode, so it's good to be able to tell the gentleman responsible for it that. I have not seen Vic's series. I did watch Phase 2, Jim Cawley's web series, and I liked that very much. But then, I hate to talk about politics, but what's CBS doing? I think they have a cash cow, and they're just looking at it for money and for their streaming service. And I think they're shooting the fans in the foot, and hopefully things are going to change over there sometime soon. I don't know if either the gentlemen on the line want to comment on that.
Well, we'll ask them.
But
that's a good point. I said we'll ask them. That's a great point. That they are kind of controlling the Star Trek fan base a little bit, where you have to pay them for their CBS All Access in order to enjoy the Star Trek product.
It's a corporation.
Well, in my
CBS
opinion,
had
it's
nothing
not
to do with the making of the original show. It
even
was
enjoyable.
Desilu, and it was on NBC. But they acquired it down the road with a merger with Paramount, and so CBS now has control of all the TV different series that Star Trek had. And I think each one has kind of gone down a little bit in quality from the original. We had problems on Next Generation because when I was in there pitching stories and I talked to a lot of the other writers, the problem was is all the characters liked each other. They all got along. And so that takes drama out of the show. If you look back at the original, there was a lot of friction between Kirk and McCoy and Spock, particularly between McCoy and Spock. And a lot of the good drama comes out of that. And I used to think not even Shakespeare could write a good episode of Next Generation. Now, my episode, Sarek, one of the stories that I brought in, was the first. I was trying to find a way for the regular cast members to have conflict, and so by having Sarek on the ship and going through senility, and Vulcans being a little telepathic, it was like putting itching powder down the pants of the other characters, and they were getting a little irritable with each other, and the cast loved it. And they said, we got to do more of these type of shows. So the writers started trying to think of other ways to introduce that kind of conflict. But if you look at the first year or two of Star Trek The Next Generation, it's pretty, it's not that exciting. But starting in Season 3 and going forward and bringing in the Borg, I think the show got a lot better. And Vic, I'll let you jump in because, I haven't really gotten into Discovery yet. I don't watch everything just because it's Star Trek stamped on it. But the show I like and the show I think CBS should have gone with for their streaming channel is Star Trek Continues.
Thank you so much, Mark. Tim, I'd like to say to your listener, John, who just called in, I don't know if he's still on the line or not.
He's still on the line.
But, John, I'm very familiar with all of the other fan series, including the one you mentioned, and I can promise you, even though I'm partial, I can promise you that nothing else touches Star Trek Continues. If you enjoyed the other fan series you've seen, I hope you'll check out our series, and I think you will agree with most everybody else that it's definitely, it's like watching the fourth and fifth seasons of the original series that never happened.
John D.
Grant,
Black,
so I think
who I
did
mentioned
catch an
earlier, he was the
episode
associate
somewhere.
producer on the first season of the first Star Trek, and wrote the great episode, The Naked Time. He watched, I got him to watch a couple episodes of Star Trek Continues, and I introduced him to Vic, and he sat in as story editor on a couple episodes for Star Trek Continues. He thought it was fantastic. And when Vic was doing the audiobook for us, which has just come out recently, Dorothy Fontana came in and read her own parts, read her own memos, as a lot of the people did, and Vic told her about Star Trek Continues. So I'll let you pick up that story, Vic, but I know she was very, very impressed.
Well, I definitely want to get more into the audiobook. Let's just say goodbye to John. John, thank you very much for the phone call and for calling in and sharing your thoughts and not holding back about what you think. All right, so we will keep the phone lines open, but I do want to talk about the audiobook. Let's just clarify, just for the audience, let's give them a little bit more information. This is the audiobook version of the three books that you wrote, Mark? Was there a different one for each season?
I wrote a book for each season, and these are 500-page books each because, every chapter's got 20 pages filled with these memos and everything else to where you hear Gene Roddenberry and Dorothy Fontana and Gene Kuhn and Bob Justman talking about each episode as they were making them, as they were writing the scripts, the fights with NBC, everything. So it's like you're in a room witnessing all this happening for every episode. And Vic put together this audiobook. He's the producer, and he reads all my words. But he brought in original people from Star Trek like D.C. Fontana and casting director Joe D'Agostà and guest stars. And for some of the people who couldn't come, we had just lost Leonard Nimoy, so Adam Nimoy came in for him. Chris Doohan, who plays Scotty in Star Trek Continues, came in and did his father. Rod Roddenberry, Gene's son, is on the book. But I'll let Vic pick this up because he's the guy who should take a bow for this amazing 28-hour audio production.
Wow.
Yeah, it was quite an ambitious project. You know, Tim, if you're going to do an audiobook, most audiobooks, if you've ever listened to an audiobook, most people have, it's just one person.
Right.
It's one guy, and he reads all of the characters, and he does the narration, and then he'll change his voice maybe in some small way to signify the different characters. And when I was kind of planning and organizing how I was going to attack this monstrous book, I thought to myself, you know, there are more than 100 people in this book, and I don't want to have to read them all, and I wouldn't want to try to differentiate between all the different people. And then I started thinking, wouldn't it be cool if I assigned a voice to each of the main people, and then I would be the narrator, and then anytime Gene Roddenberry spoke, you would hear this other voice, and it would be the voice of Roddenberry. Now, of course, Gene has passed, but the sound supervisor for Star Trek Continues, Ralph Miller, does an amazing Gene Roddenberry voice, and he was the voice of Gene Roddenberry. And then Bob Justman, and then like Mark said, any of the original people who were still around, like Dorothy and Joe D'Agosta and Clint Howard and Bobby Clark, and people that were part of the original series came in and did their own excerpts. And it's really wonderful because it's almost like a radio play. You feel like you're sitting there listening to these people recount their own experiences in their own words. As you can imagine, I basically quadrupled my workload by deciding to do that, because I had to bring all these people in and coordinate all the recording. But I thought that it would make so much more fun to listen to. It would be so much more entertaining for the audience, and it turned out great. Mark paid me the finest compliment when he said that I sent them the first chapter just to give him an idea of what I was doing, and Mark thought he would just listen to the first couple of minutes because, of course, he wrote the book, so he knew the book inside and out, and he ended up listening to the whole chapter, because even if you've read the printed book, listening to the audio book and hearing these different voices of these people, these iconic figures who made this iconic show, it's like you never read the book. It's like reading it for the first time.
Well, because they're going to be able to bring an emotion that even the best voice actors aren't, they weren't there. So they can't convey it as well as the people who actually live this can do so.
Right.
Yeah, but even then, if you're hearing a different voice, let's say, for instance, every time Jerry Finnerman, the director of photography, speaks, it's not me, it's Matt Busey, our director of photography for Star Trek Continues. Mm-hmm. So you start to recognize, oh, that's the director of photography talking now, and oh, that's Roddenberry. And you come to, like I say, as the listener, you come to feel like you're actually listening to the actual people recount their own firsthand experiences in making the series.
And when we couldn't get the real people, because we've lost a lot of them so sadly, but we get their offspring, or as Vic just mentioned, he got his director of photography to do Jerry Finneman's voice because he relates to it. I mean, he's imitating Jerry Finneman's lighting and camera work on Star Trek Continues from the original show. So for him providing the voice for Jerry, he knows what he's talking about. He knows how to speak it.
And we did that kind of thing several times. Most people that are big Star Trek fans know names like Alexander Courage and Saul Kaplan and the George Dooning and the people that wrote the music for Star Trek. Well, they were quoted in the book, and what I did was I had a gentleman named Andy Farber, who was a composer of original orchestral scores for Star Trek Continues, to be the voice of Alexander Courage.
And I feel like for fans of Star Trek, excuse me, they're going to appreciate not only the fact that you were able to bring all these stories together, Mark, in writing the book, and that you were able to bring all these voices together in the production of the audiobook, but they're going to tell the love. They're going to be able to feel the love that both of you have for Star Trek. To put into this that it's more than just a job for either one of you. The passion that you have for it probably plays out in both projects.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I've got Vic mentioned I paid him a compliment by listening to it. I could not stop listening to it. It was as if I hadn't written it, because it's a performance that's going. It's an audio play that's coming right at me. But I got the same compliment paid to me by Dorothy and Leonard Nimoy and Walter Koenig and so many others who read the book, and they would call me up and they would say, "Mark, it was like you took us back. It was like we were there." And I'll tell you just one quick one. Harlan Ellison, another one we just lost recently. I interviewed him for the book, of course, and all the writers and all the directors and all the guest players, everybody I could get, and crew members, behind-the-scenes people. But I interviewed Harlan, and Harlan, very distinctive. He scares people. He's so witty, and he can get on the attack when he wants to. He's funny, but he gets on the attack. And so you're always a little nervous when Harlan's kind of coming at you. Well, my phone rang after the book came out, and we sent copies to everybody. And the phone rings, and there's Harlan Ellison's name on my phone. And I thought, uh-oh. And I picked it up. I said, "Hi, Harlan." He says, "Cushman?" I said, "Yeah, Harlan." He says, "I'm not going to say it's great. He said, "I'm not going to say it's awesome, because awesome is a word I reserve for Eleanor Roosevelt and the Grand Canyon. But it comes close." So, I was shaking in my chair, and he said that, and I just started laughing out loud, because I did not expect a compliment from Harlan Ellison.
Well, I mean, that just goes to show that everybody out there that's a Star Trek fan, you should pick up the books and pick up the audiobook, because, like Vic was saying, it's a different experience. It's one thing to hold the book in your hand and to go through it, or to hold the 3 books in your hand and go through them, but it's another thing to be able to hear it being portrayed for you as well. So pick up both, and can they get them all from your website, Mark, or where should they go to get each one?
My publisher is Jacobs Brown Media Group. That's a little hard to remember, but you could type in thesearethevoyagesbooks.com. It'll take you to their website. You can get the books there, signed by the author. You can get the audiobook there. The audiobook's also available on AllSound, AWESOUND, and .com. And you can get the books at Barnes & Noble. You can get the books at Amazon, but you can only get the audiobook through Jacobs Brown and AllSound. Excellent.
And
Tim,
sorry, go ahead, Vic.
Tim, if I may say, Tim, for the Star Trek fans out there in your audience, I am a huge original series Star Trek fan. And when I thought I knew a lot about this show, and when I read these books, I was regularly blown away by new things that I learned. I found out so much about the show, the making of the show, the actors, the behind-the-scenes people, the networks, the arguments, the challenges, all of it. As a hardcore, lifelong Star Trek fan, I learned so much from these books. So your Star Trek fans in your audience, even if you think, well, I know all there is to know about Star Trek, you would be amazed at how much information there is in these books, and they're just a treasure trove of wonderful stories.
Can I ask Vic a question, Tim?
Sure.
I've never asked him this, and I'm just curious. Vic, you loved the show to death before you ever read that book and did the audiobook, of course.
Yeah.
And if he hadn't done the audiobook, he probably wouldn't have read it, because it was such a big book, and Vic's such a busy guy. But did it change the way you feel about any of the episodes? When you watch an episode now, do you see it in a different light, knowing what they went through to make it and why they wanted to make that particular episode?
That's a great question, Mark. And you know what? You have to understand also that when I read this book, I was not reading it just from the standpoint of a Star Trek fan, but I was reading it from the standpoint of an executive producer of a Star Trek TV series. And I was daily amazed by the way they came up with certain decisions about different scripts, the way they were under the gun for this shooting day, the problems they had with this episode, the difficulties they had with this script and this writer and production and special effects and so many things that we even had to deal with in my series. And I thought, wow, it just made it so real to me that these were people that were pioneering new territory in television. They were having to come up with things that had never been done before and trying to figure out how to do them. And it was mind-blowing to me. It was such an amazing experience. I loved every minute of reading this book.
Jim, do I have time for a 30-second story?
Absolutely.
Well, like, I wanted to know all this stuff too, and I was just like a kid in a candy store going through all these boxes of memos and all the production reports and so forth. And there was an episode I love called Shore Leave, where they're on a fantasy planet and whatever they're thinking of comes true in front of them. And there was a tiger that went after them in this episode. But if you watch the episode, the tiger's got a chain around it. And when you see the close-up, and you go, why do they have a chain on that tiger? That's silly. And I found out, reading the production reports, it's because the tiger went after William Shatner, and he had to climb up on top of a grip truck to get away from it. It almost killed him. And so nobody wanted to be near the tiger. They had to put a chain around it to keep it from killing the star of the show.
Wow. Well, I'm going to ask you one more question, Vic, and that being that, okay, there's been three, if we want to count, playing him as a kid, but there's been two actors that have embodied Captain Kirk over the years for people, and so you're stepping into some shoes that are pretty much owned, especially at the time that you did it, by William Shatner. Was there a lot of trepidation about having to play that role in Star Trek Continues?
Definitely. I love Bill Shatner. I love Captain Kirk. I love William Shatner. I've come to know him and be friends with him, and I wanted to honor him. The last thing I would ever want to do would be to not only do a poor job of playing the character, but worse, ever have anyone think that I was satirizing him or doing some kind of a parody of Captain Kirk, like a lot of people do sometimes. And so when I'll never forget, the very first episode that we shot, I was standing in the turbo lift with Chris Doohan. Here we are in perfect uniforms, makeup, ready to walk out onto the bridge of the Enterprise for the first time. And I remember thinking to myself, oh my God, like, what if it's no good? Like, that's the kind of thing you fantasize about when you're a little boy, but you'll never get to do it, so it's nothing you really have to think about. It's like saying, wouldn't it be cool to be a fighter jet pilot? Well, I'm never going to be a fighter jet pilot, so I'd never have to worry about actually doing that. But dreaming of playing your childhood hero, and then 4 decades later, you are standing on a perfect recreation of the soundstage, wearing a perfect uniform made of the same fabric, surrounded by people that look like, and in costume of the other characters, and suddenly there's this very daunting, overwhelming anxiety that you want it to be good. You want to pay the proper tribute to it, and to Shatner and Kirk. And I will tell you that we have had thousands of emails about our show come in, and a lot of people say, what I loved about your show was you guys weren't imitating the characters, you were kind of embodying the characters. It wasn't like an imitation. It was different. We felt like we were watching the original show. After 10 minutes, I forgot I was watching a fan production. That's probably the highest compliment anyone could pay us. I wanted to pay tribute to Bill Shatner and Kirk and Star Trek, and most everyone that I brought into the series had the same feeling. We were unified in that desire to pay tribute and honor to those who made the original series.
And Mark, one last question for you. I know that in the grand scheme of things, you've had a relatively small part in the grand Star Trek universe. But if you could speak for everybody that's been involved with it, going all the way back to Gene Roddenberry, what are you most proudest about what Star Trek has meant to people over the years?
It inspires us. I mean, look what it's done with technology. The cell phone, the internet, the Spock's computer. We all have these things because the kids watching the show went on to invent this stuff as adults. And just the changes that television went through because of the show. The new edition of Time magazine has Shatner and Nimoy and all the others on the cover from Star Trek. And the headline under the picture is the most influential show in the history of television.
And it certainly is. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us tonight and for going down memory lane with us when it comes to Star Trek, but also looking toward the future as well. We thank you both, and hopefully we can do this again sometime. Let's make it an annual thing where we spend some time reminiscing about Star Trek.
Love to, Tim.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And in the meantime, Tim, I hope you'll check out Star Trek Continues.
Absolutely. Why don't you give everybody the website one more time, Vic, so that they can go and find it for themselves?
StarTrekContinues.com. We are on Facebook as well. Join our Facebook group, Star Trek Continues, and check them out. Like I said, everything is there, and it's all free.
And we didn't even scratch the surface of all of Mark's other work, including some work on some work going back and reminiscing about the show Lost in Space, which, he might be listening. He's in the sound of our voice. Mark Goddard actually lives somewhere in our listening area. So
Mark Goddard wrote the foreword to one of the wonderful person.
So maybe there's a whole other episode we can do as well.
Okay, love to.
All right, guys. Thank you so much. Happy New Year to you, and we'll talk again soon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Take care.
So much.
And to everybody out there listening, thank you for joining us tonight. It was a really, really fun show, and I can't wait to talk some more Star Trek with these guys in the future. And if you have any thoughts on Star Trek that you want to share with us, you can email us, spookycrew@spookysouthcoast.com. That's how you can get a hold of us at any time during the week. Follow us on Twitter @SpookySC, on Instagram @Spooky_Southcoast. Follow me @Tim Weisberg, pretty much across all social media. And we look forward to talking to you again. We should have a show next week. Little inside information. Next Saturday is my birthday. So as far as I know, I'll be here doing the show. But, things might change. Keep an eye on the Spooky South Coast Twitter account and on my Twitter @Tim Weisberg to see if anything changes with that. So until next time, for Matt, for Stephanie, I am Tim. We want you all to stay spooktacular.